Thank you. May I ask another question? You have used the term apocalyptic literature several times now. Could you please give us a definition?
Joshua, I'd love to give you a definition of apocalyptic literature. Certainly our discussion is part of a greater truth that I would just like to momentarily discuss with you, Joshua. The idea being this, that the Bible has different genres or types of literature. Perhaps the best way to understand that is to simply pick up a local newspaper. And on the front page, you've got stuff that is pretty much factual. It tells you what's happened in the world, in your community, perhaps in your country. But then as you open other sections of the newspaper, you might turn to something like the editorial page. And that's a little bit of a different genre or writing. The editorial page is not intent with composing literature that is talking about facts in terms of dates and people and places and events. The editorial section is someone's opinion, or many people's different opinions. Well, then we might turn to my favorite section, the comic strips. And my favorite comic strip is Zits. Now, Zits is about Jeremy, who is a 15 to 16-year-old teenager, and he is going through everything you would imagine a young teenage boy in high school would be going through. Well, this particular comic strip, someone sometimes has Jeremy all over the place in terms of the living room because he's growing so fast. Other times he has all of these different thoughts, so his brain is opened up and it has all of these thoughts springing out. We're not to understand this literally. The comic strip is trying to make a point by means of, in this case, exaggeration. What I'm trying to say here, Joshua, is that any newspaper has different kinds of genres, from the sublime to the ridiculous, from the intense reporting in the front page to the editorial to the comic strips. The Bible has, in similar fashion, a wide variety of different genres, different forms of writing. So we have historical narrative, poetry, laments, proverbs, parables, epistles, just to name a few. But one of these major genres is apocalyptic. And apocalyptic needs to be approached in a different way, just like a parable would be approached differently, or a Pauline epistle, or a psalm, or a text like the book of Genesis. Apocalyptic is not front page of the newspaper. It's not to be taken literalistically. If anything, apocalyptic is more like Jeremy and Zits. It's to be understood figuratively, that through the apocalyptic literature, something greater is being said. Apocalyptic simply comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, which means unveiling. The first thing I'd like to say about apocalyptic literature is that it occurs several times in the Old Testament. Many people would call Isaiah 24 through 27 the Isaianic apocalypse, because it deals with different topics in different ways. But also, another section of apocalyptic literature is Ezekiel 38 and 39, where there's a description of Gog and Magog and their defeat and humiliation and destruction. But these are just little snippets of apocalyptic. Once we get to Daniel, specifically Daniel's visions and dreams and prophecies and use of numbers and colors and visions and beasts and statues, etc. We are full-blown into apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature would have at least these points that would help us define it. First, apocalyptic literature is written for insiders. What's that mean? Apocalyptic literature is normally written when the people of God are hunkering down due to intense persecution, intense suffering and trial and tribulation. That's exactly what's going on in the book of Daniel. As we said earlier, Daniel was part of the group that was in an early deportation to Babylon. And the people there are persecuted. They have all kinds of enemies around them. So Daniel has to write in apocalyptic literature so that the insiders, believers, can understand, but so the outsiders don't get it. Because if the outsiders understood what the insiders believed, they would persecute them all the more. So that's the first component of apocalyptic literature. It's for insiders, using inside language and inside codes and numerology. It's not for outsiders, because if it's using our language, the outsiders would get it and they wouldn't understand it. Very important. It's underground literature, if you will. The second component to apocalyptic literature is it's very much of a dualistic type of writing. Although the Bible doesn't believe philosophically in dualism, which says that there's 50% of good in the world and 50% evil in the world, rather the Bible teaches that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, is certainly way above the 50% mark when it comes to His reign and rule and defeat of evil. But apocalyptic literature gets very close to a 50-50 kind of understanding, where evil almost looks like it's going to get a 51% majority and take over. So that's the second definition that we want to use in apocalyptic literature. A very high degree of dualism. Third, apocalyptic literature is highly eschatological. That is to say, it speaks about the end over and over again. It's not so concerned with God's salvation of people in time, but rather God's salvation of people at the end of time. Fourth, apocalyptic literature is pessimistic about the world. It just simply sees the world getting worse and worse and worse, darker and darker and darker, more and more and more Chicago Cub-like, if you will. They're only optimistic, that is, apocalyptic writers, about God's intervention to finally judge the world and bring about the bodily resurrection of all. A fifth component to apocalyptic literature is that it uses various secondary features, like visions and angels and numerology. It talks about colors and beasts and bizarre visions. So if prophetic literature is salvation in history, apocalyptic is finally salvation from the history of this world to a new and better world, indeed a new heavens and a new earth. So, Daniel is very much apocalyptic. We saw in our previous discussion his visions about the end of time, where God will set up His kingdom that's an everlasting dominion. Specifically at the end of Daniel 9, where he speaks of 70 sevens and 62 sevens and the Messiah being cut off halfway through the 69th seven. All the numerology. This is the book of Daniel. To a large extent, it's apocalyptic. It's looking at the end of time. That's why I made the point earlier that Daniel and the book of Revelation have much in common, because the apocalyptic sections of the New Testament would include our Lord's Olivet Discourse in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Certain sections of 2 Thessalonians, specifically chapter 2. But in the book of Revelation, we see apocalyptic all over the place. Beginning with chapter 4, verse 1, continuing through the rest of this 22-chapter book, these apocalyptic themes come up again and again and again. And just as Daniel had to write in coded language during the Babylonian exile, so John, when he is on the island of Patmos, must write using this apocalyptic genre, because he doesn't want Domitian and the Roman Empire to understand the message of the book. Because Revelation 11 verse 15 summarizes the entire last book of the Bible. The kingdom of our Lord will become the kingdom of His Christ, and He will reign forever and ever. That's not what the Romans would want to hear. So John borrows heavily from the book of Daniel so he can speak a word of hope and comfort to the people of his day, the 7 churches in Asia Minor, who he writes the Revelation to. So Joshua, I hope you can make the connecting links between Daniel and Revelation and see that these are both highly apocalyptic pieces of literature, not to be taken literalistically, but rather figuratively, to see in, with, and under the numerology, the visions, etc., God's message of hope and comfort for a persecuted people.